Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Outer Rim Checkpoint 19 had seen its share of oddities. When you're positioned at the intersection of 9 different trade routes, serving as the primary gateway between the civilized core worlds and the lawless frontier territories, you develop a certain, let's call it, tolerance for the unusual. 3-headed merchants haggling in 6 languages simultaneously. Tuesday, a Volmaran pleasure cruiser trying to smuggle contraband inside a hollowed-out asteroid. Happens monthly. A sentient gas cloud filing for refugee status. There's a form for that. But this was new. Sergeant Fallon walked through the main entrance of the checkpoint like she owned the place. Shoulders back, duffel bag slung casually over one arm, boots striking the polished composite floor with the kind of rhythm that spoke of military training and complete confidence. Her dark hair was pulled into a practical bun, and her gray utility jacket showed the wear of someone who actually worked for a living rather than just posing in tactical gear. She had the look of someone who'd just spent 3 weeks doing something unpleasant in an unpleasant place and was thoroughly done with being pleasant about it. That part wasn't unusual. Plenty of contractors and freelancers came through Checkpoint 19 looking exactly like that. What was unusual, and here's where things get interesting, were the 4 shadows that followed her. They moved with liquid grace, each one roughly the size of a large dog, but built like something evolution had designed specifically to give prey animals nightmares. Obsidian scales caught the checkpoint's fluorescent lighting and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Golden eyes, slitted like a cat's, but somehow more aware, tracked every movement in the crowded terminal. Muscles rippled beneath that scaled hide with each padding step. Retractable claws, currently sheathed thankfully, made clicking sounds against the floor despite their obvious attempt at stealth. Rixian predators, 4 of them. Adolescents, maybe 10 months old, which meant they were only moderately capable of ripping a person in half rather than completely capable. That's what passes for reassuring when discussing apex predators from the jungle moon of Praxis 6. They followed the human woman in a loose formation that somehow managed to be both protective and deferential. 2 flanked her, 1 walked slightly ahead, and 1 brought up the rear. Their heads swiveled constantly, taking in threats, calculating distances, measuring every person in the terminal against some internal threat assessment matrix. Now, in any reasonable universe, this would be where security opens fire, or at least where alarms start screaming and armed guards create a perimeter while someone radios for heavy weapons and possibly a priest. But reasonable and the Outer Rim don't often share cocktails, and what actually happened was somehow stranger. The checkpoint erupted into chaos, sure. A floor van merchant dropped an entire crate of crystallized spices. There goes his profit margin for the quarter, and scrambled backward with impressive speed for a species that doesn't actually have legs. A family of pangolins, the small fuzzy bipeds from the Andromeda sector, grabbed their younglings and bolted for the nearest exit. Several species whose names would break your tongue and possibly your jaw started making sounds that universal translators wisely chose not to interpret. The checkpoint's alarm system, which had been installed by the lowest bidder and maintained with the enthusiasm of someone doing community service, let out a half-hearted whoop before giving up entirely. Security guards in mismatched armor, because budget constraints are universal, came running from 3 different directions, weapons drawn, but fingers thankfully not on triggers. Yet. Fallon kept walking. Didn't speed up, didn't slow down, didn't even look particularly concerned about the pandemonium spreading in her wake like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. The cubs matched her pace perfectly, adjusting their formation as the crowd scattered around them. "Ma'am, you need to—" One guard started, and then stopped so abruptly he nearly tripped over his own feet. Because at the front of the security response, standing between Fallon and roughly 20 armed guards with itchy trigger fingers, was Guard Commander Thrumach. He was Oltari. Think a mantis shrimp crossed with a knight in armor. If that knight stood 8 feet tall and had compound eyes that could see in 17 different spectrums. 4 arms, each ending in 3-fingered hands that could crush steel or perform microsurgery depending on his mood. Chitin plating that had seen combat and won. The kind of presence that makes smart people reconsider their life choices. Thrumach looked at Fallon, looked at the cubs, looked at the absolute chaos brewing in the terminal behind them. Then he snapped to attention with military precision that would make a parade ground instructor weep with joy, and rendered a salute so crisp you could hear it. The effect was instantaneous. Every guard in the terminal, and there were at least 30 now, because security had an annoying habit of multiplying when things got interesting, froze mid-panic and followed suit. Weapons lowered, backs straightened, hands moved to foreheads, or whatever equivalent their species' anatomy permitted. The chaos didn't stop exactly, but it acquired a sort of organized confusion, like a hurricane being informed it needed to fill out the proper forms. Fallon stopped walking. The cubs stopped with her, so synchronized it looked choreographed. She stared at Thrumach with the expression of someone who'd just been handed a puzzle box and told it contained either a bomb or a sandwich, but no one would specify which. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of respect and "what the hell is happening" that comes from military training meeting genuine bewilderment. Thrumach held the salute. Behind him, his guards held theirs. In the terminal, several species who had been fleeing for their lives slowed down to watch, because apparently curiosity really does override survival instinct. One of the cubs, the one that had been walking slightly ahead, padded forward and sat at Thrumach's feet, looking up at the towering Oltari warrior with what could only be described as expectant pride. If the cub had hands instead of paws, it would have been saluting too. "Sergeant," Thrumach said, his voice resonating with harmonics that made the translator work overtime. "Welcome to Checkpoint 19. Your companions are recognized." He lowered the salute. The guards followed suit with varying degrees of confusion. Some looked like they understood what was happening. Most looked like they were 3 seconds away from requesting reassignment to literally anywhere else. Fallon glanced down at the cubs, who were now arranged around her in a formation that suggested they'd done this before, or possibly had been trained to do this, which raised about 16 different questions. The cubs looked back at her with golden eyes that managed to project both fierce loyalty and smug satisfaction. "Recognized," Fallon repeated slowly, tasting the word like it might explode. "Commander, I'm just trying to get through customs, file my contract completion paperwork, and find somewhere that serves coffee strong enough to strip paint. I don't suppose we could skip whatever this is and go straight to the boring part?" "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not possible," Thrumach said, and there was something in his tone, respect, maybe, or memory, that suggested this wasn't standard protocol. Regulations require all arrivals traveling with companions to proceed through enhanced processing. "Enhanced processing," Fallon said flatly. "Is that what we're calling it?" "It's what the manual calls it, ma'am. What I call it involves more profanity than is appropriate for public broadcast." Despite everything, the chaos, the confusion, the four predators currently using her as a reference point for their defensive perimeter, Fallon's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. The kind of expression shared between people who've dealt with bureaucracy long enough to know it's the real enemy. "Fine," she said. "Lead the way, Commander. Try not to let anyone shoot my entourage." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Thrumach gestured toward one of the checkpoint's side corridors, where a sign helpfully indicated processing. Lane 9. Special circumstances in 12 different languages and 2 forms of interpretive light pattern. If you'll follow me, and perhaps instruct your companions to avoid eye contact with the civilians. The floor van merchant looks like he's about to molt from stress. Fallon whistled. 2 short notes, 1 long. The cubs immediately shifted their attention from the crowd to her, golden eyes focusing with laser intensity. She made a hand gesture, subtle but deliberate. Fingers together, palm down, a small motion forward. The cubs moved into a tighter formation, heads lowered slightly, projecting just marginally less predatory menace. Marginally. As they walked through the terminal, following Thrumach's lead, the crowd parted like someone had installed invisible force fields. A young Pangal child, braver or more foolish than its parents, peeked around a support pillar at the cubs. One of the cubs, the smallest one, bringing up the rear, turned its head and made a sound that was probably meant to be friendly, but came out sounding like grinding metal, wrapped in a purr. The Pangal child squeaked and vanished back behind the pillar. "Well," Fallon muttered, just loud enough for the cubs to hear. "At least you tried." The checkpoint's main terminal was a study in controlled chaos under the best circumstances. Arrivals from a dozen worlds trying to navigate customs, while departures scrambled to make their launch windows. Vendors selling everything from legitimate merchandise to things that were definitely not legitimate, but came with a money-back guarantee if you didn't ask questions. Information kiosks staffed by harried aliens who'd given up on helpfulness and settled for not actively making things worse. The smell of ozone from the transport pads mixed with cooking food from 6 different culinary traditions and possibly 1 science experiment. Through it all, Fallon and her escort of predators and guards moved in their own bubble of space. Other travelers gave them a berth you could park a freight hauler in. Smart money stayed back. Curious money took pictures from a safe distance. Stupid money tried to get closer for a better view and got firmly redirected by Thrumach's guards. "So," Fallon said as they walked, pitched for Thrumach's hearing only, "want to tell me why you just saluted a bunch of adolescent predators?" Thrumach's compound eyes swiveled to look at her without his head moving, the Oltari equivalent of a sidelong glance. "Want to tell me why they're following you like trained military assets instead of trying to eat everyone in a 50-meter radius?" "Touché," Fallon admitted, "though if I'm being honest, I was hoping you'd tell me that part." They reached the corridor to processing lane 9. The door hissed open, revealing a passageway that was significantly less crowded and significantly more utilitarian than the main terminal. Bare walls, functional lighting, the kind of place where bureaucracy happened without the veneer of customer service. One of the cubs growled, low, questioning. "I know," Fallon said quietly. "I don't like narrow spaces either. But we're not getting off this station without going through channels, and if we try, then everyone definitely starts shooting." The cub subsided, though its body language suggested it was filing a formal complaint for later review. As they walked down the corridor, Thrumach glanced back at the cubs, then at Fallon, then at the cubs again. His translator caught something that might have been a sigh or might have been a weapon charging, depending on your species. "Sergeant," he said finally, "I think we need to have a conversation. A real one. After processing." "Looking forward to it," Fallon replied, and she managed to sound like she meant it, despite the obvious lies. Nothing I love more than mysterious statements from armed officials in isolated corridors. Really sets the mood. Behind them, the checkpoint terminal slowly returned to its normal chaos, though several security guards remained posted near the entrance, just in case. The Florvan merchant discovered that dropping crystallized spices actually improves their market value if you can spin the story right. The Pangol family debated whether they'd witnessed something amazing or terrifying, eventually settling on both. And somewhere in the station's security office, someone filed an incident report that would become legendary for its creative use of the phrase, "circumstances beyond standard operational parameters." In processing Lane 9, things were about to get complicated. But then again, when you walk into an interstellar checkpoint, followed by 4 predators who move like soldiers and a guard commander who salutes them on sight, complicated is probably the best you can hope for. Processing Lane 9 turned out to be less of a lane and more of a glorified closet with delusions of importance. The room barely qualified as a room, more like someone had looked at a storage space and thought, "You know what this needs? A desk and crushing existential dread." Behind that desk sat Lifax, and if there was ever a being less suited to handle stress, evolution hadn't documented it. He was Glimmerian, which meant his entire body was translucent gel that shifted colors based on emotional state. Right now, he was cycling through shades of green and yellow so rapidly it looked like someone was shaking a lava lamp having an anxiety attack. "Oh no," Lifax said as Fallon entered, followed by 4 apex predators and a guard commander. "Oh no, no, no. This is not. I cannot. The forms for this don't even exist." "Then I guess this'll be quick," Fallon said, dropping her duffel bag on the floor with a thud that suggested it contained either bricks or weapons. Possibly both. The cubs arranged themselves around the bag in a formation that was definitely protective and possibly possessive. "I'm returning from contract fulfillment on Praxis 6. Standard security sweep, nothing fancy. Just need clearance to proceed to departure gates." Lifax's gelatinous form quivered. His color shifted to a shade of orange that the translator helpfully identified as acute distress, bordering on panic. "Madam, you have, and I'm reading my scanner correctly here, 4 Class 8 predatory organisms from a restricted world following you like puppies. Puppies that could disembowel me before my pain receptors registered the attack." "They won't disembowel you," Fallon said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the casual air of someone who'd done this dance before. Probably. "Lifax," Thrumach said from his position by the door, managing to sound both authoritative and sympathetic. "Let's start with standard intake questioning. Maybe the answers will make this easier." "Nothing about this is easy," Lifax muttered, but his form solidified slightly as he pulled up a holographic interface. Fine. Name?" "Fallon. Sergeant, retired. Current contractor designation Gulf Tango 968. Purpose of travel to Praxis 6? Security contract, private sector, anti-smuggling operations in the equatorial zone." Lifax's fingers, well, the gelatinous approximations of fingers, danced across the interface. "And the predators? Were they part of the contract?" Fallon was quiet for a moment. One of the cubs, sensing the shift in her mood, pressed against her leg. She reached down absently and scratched behind what passed for its ears. A gesture so natural it spoke of repetition, of routine, of bond. "No," she said finally. They were not part of the contract. Then where did they— 3 weeks ago, Fallon interrupted, her voice taking on that flat quality people use when recounting things they'd rather forget. I was tracking a weapons smuggling ring through the northern jungle territories. Got a tip about unusual energy signatures in an area that should have been uninhabited. Turned out the smugglers had branched out into more, let's say, exotic merchandise. Lifax's color shifted to pale blue, the Glimmerian equivalent of, "Oh no, I don't want to hear this, but I have to hear this." They were running a poaching operation, Fallon continued. Rixian predators fetch a high price on the exotic pet market. Rich idiots who want a dangerous animal they can show off at parties, at least until it eats someone important and has to be destroyed. The smugglers were taking cubs, killing the parents. Supply and demand, you know. The galaxy's favorite economic principle. One of the cubs made a sound, low, mournful, more felt than heard. The others shifted closer to Fallon. I found these four in a holding cage, she said. Their parents were already dead. The cubs were starving, dehydrated, traumatized. The smugglers were planning to ship them off-world the next morning. So I made an executive decision. You destroyed the operation, Thrumach said. Not a question. I destroyed the operation, Fallon confirmed. Called it in to local authorities, provided coordinates and evidence files, spent the next 2 weeks waiting for someone to arrive who could handle the cubs. But Praxis 6 doesn't exactly have robust animal welfare services, and the local government was more interested in the smuggling charges than 4 orphaned predators. So I, improvised. Improvised, Lifax repeated weakly. Fed them, treated their wounds, kept them alive. Fallon's hand was still on the cub's head, fingers working through scales with practiced care. Turns out Rixian cubs are smart. Scary smart. They picked up basic commands in about 3 days, started following me everywhere. When it was time to leave, they wouldn't stay behind. And I couldn't. I just couldn't leave them there to starve or get recaptured. The room was quiet, except for the hum of electronics and the occasional click of claws on composite flooring. Lifax's color had settled into a sort of resigned purple. That's very noble. But, madam, do you understand the regulations about importing biological organisms across interstellar boundaries? The quarantine protocols alone? Check the database, Thrumach said suddenly. Run their genetic signatures. Lifax looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Thrumach's tone suggested this was important. His gelatinous form rippled as he pulled up a different interface, this one connected to the Galactic Immigration Authority's central records. A scanner array descended from the ceiling, bathing the cubs in blue light. They didn't move, though their eyes tracked the scanner with intensity that suggested they were calculating exactly how difficult it would be to destroy it. The interface beeped, then beeped again, then made a sound that electronic systems should not make unless something has gone very wrong or very right. That's not possible, Lifax whispered, his entire form going pale. These cubs are registered. They're in the military database. Classification level, oh stars, classification level top secret. Registered as military assets under Treaty Provision 81, subsection 12. But that treaty hasn't been invoked in 15 years at least. Fallon leaned forward. Say that again? Your cubs, Lifax said, looking between her and the predators with new understanding and quite a lot of fear, are military assets. According to this database, they're protected under wartime treaties governing bonded combat pairs. But that program was discontinued after the frontier wars ended. It shouldn't. This classification shouldn't even be active anymore. Thrumach moved closer to the desk, all four arms crossed in a posture that suggested he'd just had several suspicions confirmed. What does the file say about their lineage? Most of it's redacted, classified above my clearance level. But there's a note here about genetic markers, consistent with historical combat companion breeding lines, and a flag that says any Rixian predators displaying trained behavior patterns should be reported immediately to military intelligence. Well, Fallon said slowly, looking down at the cubs who were now regarding her with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. That explains the salute. Before anyone could respond, the door hissed open. A woman strode in wearing the kind of business attire that costs more than most people's monthly salary, and screams, "I speak to managers as a hobby." Her identification badge read, "Galactic Immigration Authority," and her expression read, "I am deeply unimpressed with everything I'm currently looking at." "Coordinator Lifax," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I'm Agent Morrigan from GIA headquarters. I'm here about the unauthorized import of biological hazards. I understand we have 4 Class 8 predators that need immediate quarantine and probable destruction under Section 91 of the Interstellar Health and Safety Act." The cubs' heads all turned as one to look at Morrigan. Golden eyes assessed, calculated, and found her wanting. Fallon stood up slowly. "I'm sorry, destruction?" "Standard protocol for dangerous organisms without proper documentation," Morrigan said, not even bothering to look at Fallon. "Now, if you'll instruct the creatures to remain calm, we have a containment team standing by." "No." The word hung in the air like a declaration of war. Morrigan finally looked at Fallon, really looked at her, and something in that gaze suggested she'd made a serious miscalculation. "I'm sorry?" Morrigan said, in a tone that indicated she was not at all sorry. "I said no," Fallon repeated, and the cubs moved, flowing into a defensive formation that put them between Morrigan and their human. "These cubs are under my protection. They're coming with me. And if you have a problem with that, we're going to have a much longer conversation involving lawyers and media attention, and several interstellar treaties I'm suddenly very interested in reading." Lifax had gone completely transparent. The Glimmerian equivalent of, "I'm not here, you can't see me, this is not my problem." Thrumach, however, was smiling. At least, that's what the translator suggested his mandible movements meant. Things were about to get very interesting. Morrigan had the look of someone who was used to winning arguments by sheer force of credentials and a well-tailored suit. She pulled out a datapad with the kind of flourish usually reserved for courtroom dramas, and began reading in the tone of someone reciting a grocery list, if that grocery list could destroy lives. Interstellar Health and Safety Act, Section 91, Paragraph 6. Any biological organism deemed hazardous to civilian populations and lacking proper import documentation shall be subject to immediate quarantine. And if said quarantine is deemed unfeasible or unsafe, immediate termination with full documentation of genetic material for research purposes. "Research purposes," Fallon said, and there was something dangerous in her voice now. Something that made even Thrumach shift his stance slightly. "Let me translate that for anyone who doesn't speak bureaucrat. You want to kill them and sell their DNA to whatever corporation is paying you the most." "I don't appreciate your tone," Morrigan said, though her expression suggested she didn't particularly care about Fallon's tone so much as the inconvenience of having to justify herself. "This is standard procedure. These creatures are dangerous. They don't have proper documentation. The law is quite clear." "Actually," Lifax said, his gelatinous form solidifying as he found something resembling courage in the depths of his database, The law is significantly less clear than you're suggesting, Agent Morrigan. According to the records I'm accessing, these cubs are registered under military treaty provisions. That supersedes standard immigration protocols. Morrigan's eyes narrowed. Registered under what authority? Treaty Provision 81, subsection 12. The Interstellar Compact on Military Companion Assets, ratified after the Frontier Wars. Lifax was gaining confidence now, probably because he was reading directly from official documents, and official documents were the Glimmerian equivalent of comfort food. Any Rixian predators displaying trained behavioral patterns and genetic markers consistent with historical combat companion lines are protected under this treaty. They cannot be classified as mere biological imports. They're considered sentient adjacent military assets with protected status. That treaty hasn't been active in 15 years, Morrigan countered. The companion program was discontinued. Those provisions are obsolete. Obsolete and inactive are not the same as void, Thrumach said, stepping forward. His voice had taken on a different quality now, less checkpoint guard and more something older, something that remembered things. The treaty specifically states that its protections remain in effect for all qualifying Rixian predators and their descendants, regardless of program status. It was written that way deliberately. I should know. I was there when it was signed. That got everyone's attention. Even the cubs looked up at Thrumach with new interest. You were there, Fallon repeated slowly. At the treaty signing. Galactic Marine Corps, 5th Special Operations Group, Thrumach said, and there was pride in his voice now, the kind that comes from having earned something through blood and fire. I served alongside human units during the Frontier Wars, saw Ghost Company in action more times than I can count, watched human Rixian bonded pairs do things that shouldn't have been possible. They were, without exaggeration, the most effective combat units in the entire war. He moved closer to the cubs, who watched him with those golden eyes, but didn't retreat. One of them, the largest, made a low sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a purr. Recognition, maybe, or genetic memory of what its ancestors had been. Ghost Company, Thrumach continued, his voice taking on the quality of someone telling a story that mattered, was established in the 3rd year of the war when it became clear that conventional tactics weren't working against the insurgent forces in the outer territories. Someone, and I never did find out who, had the idea to try partnering human special forces, operators with Rixian predators. The theory was that humans could provide strategic thinking and technology, while the Rixians provided combat instinct and physical capabilities that no human could match. And it worked, Fallon said, not quite a question. It worked better than anyone predicted. The bond between human and Rixian it was something beyond training. They moved like one organism. The human would make tactical decisions, and the Rixian would execute them with precision that looked like telepathy. But it went both ways. The Rixians would sense threats before any human scanner could detect them, and the humans learned to trust those instincts absolutely. Together, they were unstoppable. Morrigan was looking increasingly uncomfortable, which was satisfying in ways that probably said unflattering things about Fallon's character. That's a lovely history lesson, Commander, but it doesn't change the fact that these specific cubs? These cubs move like Ghost Company, Thrumach interrupted, and his compound eyes were fixed on Morrigan now with uncomfortable intensity. I watched them enter this checkpoint. The formation they used? That's not natural behavior. That's the defensive diamond pattern used by bonded pairs when entering potentially hostile territory. The way they respond to her commands? That's not training she could have taught them in 3 weeks. That's genetic memory. That's breeding. These cubs are descendants of Ghost Company combat companions. That's impossible, Morrigan said, but she didn't sound quite as certain as before. All Ghost Company Rixians were returned to their homeworld after the war ended. They were supposed to be retired, integrated back into wild populations. Supposed to be, Thrumach agreed, but Rixians are intelligent. They remember, and apparently, they bred true. These cubs carry their ancestors' training in their genetics. Look at them. Really look at them. Fallon glanced down. The cubs had arranged themselves in that same formation, 2 flanking, 1 forward, 1 rear. It was protective, yes, but it was also tactical. They'd positioned themselves to cover all approaches to Fallon while maintaining sightlines to every potential threat in the room. It was the kind of positioning that took human soldiers months to learn, and these cubs were doing it by instinct. The treaty, Lifax said, his voice stronger now, was written to protect these bonds. The human delegates and the Rixian representatives both agreed that any Rixian predator that chose to bond with a human should have that choice protected under interstellar law. It wasn't about military assets. It was about respecting the relationship between 2 species that had fought together, bled together, survived together. Chose, Morrigan seized on the word. You said chose to bond. There's no evidence these creatures chose anything. They're following her because she fed them. That's not a bond. That's conditioning. You want to test that theory? Fallon asked quietly. Because I'm happy to prove you wrong. Something in her tone made Morrigan pause. What are you suggesting? The treaty, I assume, has provisions for determining whether a bond is genuine or just convenient. Lifax was frantically scrolling through documents now, his form rippling with concentration. Yes, actually. Article 18, Section 5. In cases where bond authenticity is disputed, the Rixian companion must demonstrate voluntary loyalty through choice behavior in neutral circumstances. If the Rixian consistently chooses the human partner over personal safety, food, or freedom, the bond is considered genuine and protected under all treaty provisions. Fine, Morrigan said, and now she was smiling, which was somehow more unsettling than her professional disapproval. Let's test it. Remove all verbal commands. Stand away from the creatures. My team will enter the room. If they choose you over their own safety, I'll acknowledge the bond. But if they attack my team, or flee, or show any behavior consistent with wild animals, then they're classified as dangerous biological imports and subject to immediate quarantine. And if they pass your test? Fallon asked. Then they're legally recognized as bonded companions under treaty protection. You can take them anywhere in the galaxy. Morrigan's smile widened. But they won't pass. 3 weeks of feeding is not a bond. It's barely a transaction. Thrumach looked at Fallon with concern. Sergeant, you don't have to do this. We can challenge her authority, request legal counsel. No, Fallon said, and her voice was steady despite the fact that her hands were clenched at her sides. If we fight this through channels, it'll take months. They'd hold the cubs in quarantine the whole time. I won't do that to them. She looked down at the 4 predators, who were watching her with golden eyes that held more intelligence than any animal should possess. We do this now. We prove it now. Your funeral, Morrigan said, pulling out a comm unit. Or rather, your cub's funeral. She spoke into the device, crisp and efficient. Containment team to processing lane 9. Prepare for specimen acquisition. Subjects are unrestrained and potentially hostile. Authorization code Morrigan 6 Alpha 3. Through the room's external speakers, Fallon could hear boots in the corridor. Heavy boots, multiple sets, Enforcement officers, probably armed with stun weapons at minimum, and possibly something more lethal. The cubs heard them too, ears swiveling, muscles tensing, bodies lowering into defensive crouches. "Hey," Fallon said softly, and 4 sets of golden eyes locked onto her. "It's going to be okay. I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" The largest cub made a sound, questioning, uncertain. "I know," Fallon said, and she moved away from them, walking to the far side of the room. The cubs' heads tracked her movement, but they didn't follow. Not yet. "I know this feels wrong, but I need you to show them. Show them what we are. Show them what your ancestors were." The door hissed open. 6 enforcement officers entered, wearing full tactical gear and carrying stun rifles. They moved with professional efficiency, spreading out to create a perimeter, weapons not quite aimed, but definitely ready. The cubs' formation shifted, tightening, preparing for threat response. Morrigan stood by the door, datapad in hand, already documenting what she clearly expected to be a violent incident that would justify her position. Thrumach had moved to stand beside Fallon, his forearms crossed, his expression unreadable behind compound eyes. Lifax had gone completely transparent again and was making sounds that the translator declined to interpret. And Fallon stood alone, 20 feet from the cubs, her hands at her sides, her voice calm and clear as she said one word: "Choose." The room held its breath. The enforcement officer's fingers moved closer to triggers. Morrigan's stylus hovered over her datapad, ready to record the cubs' failure. But the cubs weren't looking at the officers. They weren't looking at the weapons, or the threats, or the 6 armed individuals who represented clear and present danger. They were looking at Fallon. And then, as one, they moved. They moved not toward safety, not toward the door, not toward any logical escape route that would preserve their lives and freedom. They moved toward Fallon. The largest cub reached her first, pressing against her leg with enough force that she had to brace herself. The others followed within seconds, reforming their defensive diamond around her, 2 flanking, 1 forward scanning the enforcement officers, 1 rear watching the door. The formation was so precise, so practiced, so right, that it looked like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. Not one of them had even glanced at the exit. Not one had considered the armed officers a primary threat worth engaging. Their entire world had narrowed to a single point: the human who'd saved them, fed them, kept them alive when the galaxy had decided they were disposable. The room was silent, except for the hum of electronics and the soft clicking of claws on composite flooring. Morrigan's stylus had frozen above her datapad. Her expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like professional frustration wrapped in expensive fabric. That proves nothing. They're conditioned to follow her. It's basic behavioral psychology. "No," Thrumach said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this before, who knew what this meant. "That's the Ghost Company defensive formation, exactly as it was used during the Frontier Wars. The forward scout position, the rear guard, the flanking protectors. That's not conditioning. That's genetic memory. That's legacy." He moved closer, and the cubs tracked him but didn't break formation. The forward cub made a sound, low, questioning. Thrumach responded with a series of clicks and harmonics that his translator didn't bother interpreting. The cub's ears swiveled forward. Recognition, maybe. Or respect for someone who spoke a language older than words. "During the war," Thrumach continued, addressing the room but looking at Morrigan, "I watched a human Rixian bonded pair hold a supply depot against 40 insurgents for 6 hours. The human was wounded, couldn't walk. The Rixian could have fled, could have saved itself. Instead, it stayed, fought, bled. When reinforcements finally arrived, the Rixian was standing over its human, still in defensive formation, still protecting. That's not training. That's not conditioning. That's choice. Anecdotal evidence, Morrigan said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. This isn't a war zone. These aren't military assets. They're animals that... They're people, Fallon interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. Maybe not by your definition, maybe not in ways you can measure with your scans and protocols, but they think, they feel, they choose, and they chose me. Not because I fed them. Any smuggler could have done that. They chose me because I saw them as more than merchandise, more than biological hazards, more than problems to be solved. She looked down at the cubs, and her expression softened. They chose me because I chose them first. One of the enforcement officers, a pangol ironically, the same species as the family that had fled in the terminal, lowered his weapon. "Ma'am," he said to Morrigan, "I've been doing this job for 8 years. I've seen dangerous animals. I've seen trained attack beasts. These cubs, they're not attacking. They're not threatening. They're protecting. There's a difference." "Your opinion is noted and irrelevant," Morrigan snapped. But 2 other officers had also lowered their weapons, and her authority was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "Actually," Lifax said, and his gelatinous form had solidified into something approaching confidence, "his opinion is extremely relevant. According to Treaty Provision 81, subsection 12, paragraph 9, bonded companion status can be verified through witnessed testimony of sentient-level loyalty behavior. We have Commander Thrumach's testimony as a military witness. We have Officer Kelvin's testimony as a civilian enforcement witness. We have my testimony as the processing coordinator. And we have visual documentation of the cubs choosing their bonded partner over personal safety." He pulled up a holographic display that showed the last 3 minutes on loop, the cubs moving toward Fallon, ignoring the exit, forming their protective diamond. This is textbook bonded companion behavior. By the letter of the treaty, these cubs cannot be classified as property or biological imports. They're recognized as sentient adjacent beings with the legal right to choose their bonded partner. "This is absurd," Morrigan said, but she was already putting away her datapad. "You're setting a precedent that will cause chaos across every immigration checkpoint in the galaxy." "Good," Thrumach said simply. "Maybe it's time we remembered that laws exist to protect relationships, not destroy them." Morrigan looked at Fallon, at the cubs, at the enforcement officers who were now actively avoiding eye contact with her. She was losing, and she knew it. And there's nothing more dangerous than a bureaucrat who knows they're losing, except possibly a bureaucrat who's already lost. "Fine," she said, and the word came out like broken glass. "Process them under treaty protection. But this isn't over, Sergeant Fallon. I'll be filing a formal review with GIA headquarters. Every checkpoint you pass through, every world you visit, you'll be under scrutiny. One incident, one complaint, one hint that these creatures are dangerous, and I will personally ensure they're reclassified and terminated. Do you understand?" "Perfectly," Fallon said, and she smiled without warmth. "I'll be sure to file my own reports about GIA agents who try to circumvent interstellar treaties for personal gain. I'm sure your superiors would be fascinated to learn about your research purposes. Comment? Especially if I CC the Interstellar Ethics Committee." Morrigan's expression could have flash-frozen a star. She turned and walked out without another word, her expensive shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown to future problems. The enforcement officers filed out after her, though Officer Kelvin paused at the door. "Good luck, ma'am," he said to Fallon. "You're going to need it." When the door closed, Lifax made a sound like a deflating balloon and turned a shade of blue that suggested relief mixed with residual terror. "I'm going to need so much therapy after this. So much. But first, let me get your paperwork processed before someone else shows up with a regulation I've never heard of." 20 minutes later, Fallon walked out of Processing Lane 9 with official documentation that identified her cubs as bonded companions with full treaty protection. The cubs walked beside her, their formation slightly more relaxed now, but still precise, still protective. Thrumach was waiting in the corridor. He held out a data chip, small and unassuming but somehow weighted with importance. "Ghost Company histories," he said. "Training protocols, behavioral guides, medical information. Everything I could pull from military archives without triggering security flags. They chose you, Sergeant. Honor that choice." Fallon took the chip, closed her fist around it. "Thank you, Commander, for everything." "One more thing," Thrumach said, and his compound eyes fixed on the cubs. "They're young now, manageable, but they'll grow. They'll become what their ancestors were. Apex predators with intelligence that rivals most sentient species. When that happens, when someone inevitably asks them to fight, to become weapons again," he paused, "let it be their choice, not yours, not the galaxy's, theirs." "I will," Fallon promised. She walked through the checkpoint exit into the main spaceport terminal, 4 obsidian cubs at her heels moving in perfect formation. Other travelers parted around them, some with fear, some with curiosity, some with something that might have been respect. Behind them, in Processing Lane 9, Lifax updated a file in the system. Status: cleared. Notation: bonded companions, treaty protected. Secondary notation: do not engage without authorization from Commander Thrumach personally. And in her private office somewhere in GIA headquarters, Morrigan opened a different file. Status: pending. Because if there's one thing scarier than a human with predator companions, it's paperwork with a grudge. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, Sergeant Fallon had 4 cubs who'd chosen her, a data chip full of history, and a galaxy that was about to remember what Ghost Company had been. What it could be again.